I'm here at the Newark Cemetery, which I thought was a fitting place to go after we saw the cemetery in Norwich of the Polish nationals who had died at the mental institution. What's so significant about this cemetery is that there are dozens of Polish pilots here, Poles who joined the RAF and existing British fighter squadrons. They were instrumental in the fight against the Luftwaffe and the German bombing of London. What's interesting about this cemetery is that it also demonstrates the sort of betrayal that happened after the war. Behind me is a memorial to President Sikorski, who was the president of the Polish Republic. And along the walkway here, apart from all of these graves, we have 3 graves of presidents of Poland in exile. So you had the leader of the Polish armed forces in exile, Sikorski, and you also had a separate Polish president. And to demonstrate the level of dictatorship that existed within Poland after we abandoned them at the end of World War II, and you can see on the memorial, it's listed that Sikorski remained buried here until 1993. He said he wanted to be buried with his men up until the Polish Republic was free, and that only happened in 1993. All along here you have members also in the back of the Polish Resettlement Corps, and at the back of the cemetery, facing away from the cross, you have members of the Polish squadrons that died at a later date with slightly different gravestones. It's interesting to see that even his memorial says that he was killed in an accident off the coast of Gibraltar. I don't think that's true, because at the beginning of the massacre at Katyn, General Sikorski immediately started questioning it. And during this massacre, because the war effort was primarily against the Germans, we decided to blame the Germans, and the Russians advanced the narrative too. But Sikorski was at the front lines of saying that he immediately knew that it was the Russians. He was an experienced general. He'd fought in World War I, and he knew that something wasn't right. And his plane just so happened to mysteriously explode off the coast of Gibraltar at Europa Point. I think that there was some foul play there. I think he was assassinated. But his memorial makes no reference to this. The area just out in front of the cemetery too, right to the left of there are all the Polish graves from the war and accidents, but this is just as meaningful to me. You've got the graves of 6 Marines, US Marines who died in combat, along with some other graves that I'd like to show you. Also just outside of the graveyard from Lincoln is this a captain in the Polish Air Force, and right next to him this says he served the Polish army in the eternal rest of God. And if we go over here, we can see a Polish veteran who died in 1979. He changed his name to Joseph Strickland, but he originally had a Polish name. He was the lieutenant in the 1st Polish Armored Division, which was called the Hussars, and he died waiting for Poland to become a democracy, which sadly never happened in his lifetime. And then we have even more over here. This man saw both world wars. He was born in 1899. He was a lieutenant in the 2nd Polish Corps, and this man here. All along here are members of the RAF who died at a later date. And back here are Polish officers. This is a high-ranking lieutenant colonel, and I believe this is the grave type of the Czechoslovak Air Force, another nation that we kind of really just abandoned behind the Iron Curtain. And right next to him is the grave of this man, and it reads, he was a non-commissioned officer for the 2nd Corps, a beloved daddy and a grandfather. I'm here at the graveyard in Brandon at the local church, and behind me you can see a recent memorial set up just last year for the Poles who lived in and around this area. It's significant because it was the headquarters of the Polish Resettlement Corps. After World War II, Britain refused to let the Poles fly the Polish flag or march in the victory parade. Poland became an issue that they put on the back burner because at the Yalta Conference, the Allies allowed the Soviet Union to occupy parts of eastern Poland, and shortly after that, a communist dictatorship was set up in the country. The old generals who fought with us, among them Sikorski, and all of the Polish officers and soldiers, of the ones who went back, most of them were shot, most of them were murdered. They were considered to be spies for Western powers. And you can see behind me one of the things that this commemorates is indicative of the kind of troubles that the Poles faced, even through the war when they were fighting for us. The Katyn Massacre, if you're not familiar with the history, they were lined up in a mass grave and shot. And the Soviets built a forest above it and refused entry to anybody. And up until the fall of the Soviet Union, they completely denied this, even though just a few years after it became very obvious that this was a massacre at the hands of the Soviets. One of the men who was involved in this, a man named Sikorski, who was essentially the leader of the Polish military in exile, immediately knew that it was the Soviets who committed this massacre. But he was about to go to a conference, and his plane mysteriously crashed right off the tip of Gibraltar at Europa Point. And it has been widely considered for years that this was some kind of a conspiracy or that a bomb was planted in the cargo hold of the plane. I don't think that he just randomly died just as he started questioning the narrative of this. One of the people who was involved in pushing the narrative went into depression for the rest of his life. A British officer who was led by the Russians to think that it was a German atrocity. But this town around me, if you walk through the graveyard, you'll see dozens of Polish graves. And that's because, again, this was the center of the Polish Resettlement Corps. So not only did we abandon the country behind the Iron Curtain, but we abandoned the people who were left over here. So you can see a lot of these graves are of the elderly who died shortly after the country had transitioned to democracy, and they were now too elderly to go back. And you can also see the graves of people who died in the period where it was still a dictatorship. And this town, being the headquarters of the Polish Resettlement Corps, which was the refugee agency that held them really in shanty towns for decades. A lot of these people were just humble, middle-aged people, but they all remembered growing up in these shanty towns. And again, this is a history that's just completely covered up by Britain and attempted to, it's almost as if they tried to rip a page out of the history book or cover your ears to it.